Good afternoon, and to our friends out west, good morning. Thank you for joining us for Faith and Family, exploring the role of faith as a core of the Black family. I'm Jessica McCall, your moderator for today's conversation. As a reminder, if you've joined us before, you know that there will be a Q&A portion of our discussion, so please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. According to a recently published Pew Research report on Black Americans and religion, the Black church is alive and well in America today. But like all things, the Black community's relationship to religion, faith, and with the church has evolved since the days when boycotts and protests were organized in churches across the South and provided critical social services to underserved communities across the North. Throughout history, the church was one of the few places a Black American could seek refuge. Religious institutions were the foundation of the Black family, the seat of our political power, and provider of basic needs when the federal government and municipalities were absent. But today, when asked to assess the influence of predominantly Black churches in their communities, nearly half of Black adults say that Black churches are less influential today than they were 50 years ago. This same Pew Research survey of more than 8,000 Black adults ages 18 and older across the United States found that young Black adults are less religious and less engaged in Black churches than older generations. Rather than simply continuing family traditions, young Black Americans have become even more comfortable deciding for themselves what it means to be connected to faith or religion. And with more options to choose from, some young Black Americans are settling for being religiously unaffiliated altogether. So let's explore what these changes mean for Black families and the broader community. We've assembled a stellar panel of leaders to discuss the state of Black America's faith. So let's get started. Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce is a professor and dean of Howard University School of Divinity in Washington, D.C., and the first woman to be appointed dean in the Divinity School 150-year history. She's also the founding director of both the Center for African American Religious Life at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, as well as the Center for Black Church Studies and Associate Professor of Religion and Literature at Princeton Theological Seminary. Dr. Pierce's research specialties include African American religious history, womanist theology, African American literature, and race and religion. A native of New York, Dr. Pierce is a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated and the author of the recently released book, In My Grandmother's House, Black Women, Faith, and the Stories We Inherit. A native of Compton, California, Umar Hakim Dey is the founding principal of Encourage, an advisory organization whose objective is to disrupt irrelevant leadership in order to reestablish relevant leadership perspectives and co-design new values for a more effective situational approach. Encourage is a place where they discover and design working solutions for organizations and teach community members how to sustain themselves and avoid gentrification. Today, Mr. Dey joins us as the director of I.L.M, Intellect Love Mercy Foundation. The I.L.M Foundation applies intellect, love, and mercy into all of its efforts and is known for social responsibility, which they consider a more strategic form of charity that leads to a more sustainable change. And finally, Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein is a rabbinic scholar and public affairs advisor with the Jewish Federation of North America. JFNA represents 146 Jewish federations and over 300 network communities and protects and enhances the well-being of Jews worldwide. Rabbi Rothstein received rabbinic ordination and his Master's of Social Work from Yeshiva University. And Rabbi Rothstein has previously shared that passing for white while honoring his Jewish and African roots, he learned early that being Black, Jewish, and American was different, and saw it as his mission to help others unlock their legacy and voice. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So let's get started at the most obvious place. what is the state of the Black family and their faith and religion? I'm going to kick it to Dr. Pierce to kick us off.
So I think we are in a wonderful place to have this conversation because of all of the things that are happening in our nation. A recent election, the ongoing pandemic. We recently had a 4-hour documentary about the Black church, PBS, and Henry Louis Gates. So what I'd like to say to people is that the role of faith within African American families is extremely strong, because I'm talking about faith and not necessarily institutional religion. People confuse the two. They think that institutional religion tells them everything that they need to know about faith, but that actually is not the case. Mm-hmm. Faith is about belief. Faith is about structures and behaviors and morals and ethics and guidelines for how one lives one's life. And so within African American families, and here I don't just mean the nuclear family, but I mean the larger kinship networks that make up African American families, faith is as strong as it ever was. The idea of something outside of ourselves, something bigger than ourselves, a purpose greater than ourselves, the love for ourselves and our communities are operative within the African American context. That has very little to do with whether or not there are institutional declines within certain religions and within certain institutions. But faith and all of its rich religious diversity is as present, as operative, and as strong as ever.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Pierce. And Rabbi Rothstein, how is the faith and what's the connection within the Jewish community and the Black family?
Yes, thank you so much for having me just to start. And it's an honor to share the stage with both of you, Dr. Pierce. I just ordered your book a few moments ago, Umar. It's been a pleasure to connect with you over the last few days. And what I would say, on the question of the state of faith within the Black family, I mean, I'll speak from my personal experience growing up in a mixed race family and really picking off of what Dr. Pierce shared, the difference between faith and institutionalized religion. For me, when I think of faith, I think of the idea that everything has a spark of divinity, something bigger than who we are. It's an outlook and a lens of how we look at the world. As a mixed race Jew, my mom's side of the family who's not Jewish, who are Methodist, who are Buddhist, who are Muslim, we're people of faith. And I've learned so much about faith through my non-Jewish family members. And then, from my parents, most literally the people who brought me into the world, I would say that organized religion has brought different and has increased and enhanced my ability to interact with faith, but is also something that in the 21st century, like Dr. Pierce was picking up on, and Jessica, as you referenced, data points, organized religion on a decline. Do people feel a sense of belonging or see themselves reflected in traditional models of faith? Is a question, I think, for all major faith groups in the West and in America. One or two things that I would share around Black Jewish family, the idea of the intersections of multiple heritages, dual heritages, backgrounds. I think maybe we all feel like we have multiple ancestors that call to us and that we sit with. So, a few things that I think are common from what my mother and my father and what my families have taught me. I think the power of legacy and what legacy really means, like where we come from. What does it mean to have a story? And what does it mean when someone's story can't be told, or it was taken from them, or their land, they were censored, they were erased? What does it mean to flee and to not have access to the narrative, your full and whole identity? That's something that tugs, I think, at all parts of my background and where I come from, and central, I think, to the experience that I had growing up in a Black family, Black Jewish family.
Thank you. And Umar, as you are answering that, I want to pick up on something that Rabbi Rothstein said as far as not being able to tell your own story. And I think that is something that has happened in a a very big way for the Muslim community of not always having control over their own story and it being told for them in a way that is not reflective of the true nature of the faith. So what is the connection for you, and what is the state of the faith within your community?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for this invitation to be here. Faith in our community, in the Slauson Muslim community, is very strong. Faith in the African American community has always been very strong and relevant. It's the one thing that has carried us over the challenges that we'll face. Consequently, we are faced with the challenges: police brutality, poverty, homelessness, employment. These elements challenge our faith, and the faith that our mothers, our fathers, or the family has taught us has carried us through. Is faith the challenge? Maintaining your faith? Yes, it's a definitely challenge. When I think of it as in our faith tradition, to say Prophet Muhammad, may peace and blessings be upon him, he said faith is like a valley. You have your highs and lows. You have your highs and lows, and when you belong to a good group, a good support group, it's going to help you carry through that. As far as our story that's being told in America, I feel that we've always been in control of the Muslim narrative in America. It's just that it's going to challenge the other narratives, other religious narratives in America, because the Muslim narrative is very historical. It has roots in all the movements. It has roots in the in arriving in as enslaved individuals to the Americas. So we know who we are. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of others recognizing the origin that we all share is one story.
Great, thank you. I want to, for just a moment, go back to 2020.
2020.
Just for a moment, we'll leave it again real fast. But throughout 2020, we saw so many horrible images that were really hardest for the Black community. And we know what they all were, from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor to COVID. There was so much that we saw that, just as bad as we were feeling, made us feel worse. So I'm curious about what the conversations were within your respective communities on how to uplift the Black community, how to help us stay faithful, and what role does organized religion play in the response to these social injustice issues that we're seeing. Rabbi Rothstein, let's start with you.
Yes, thank you for that. It's interesting, like how almost a year ago, at least, I live in New York, I live in Harlem. To think about, we put on masks, but I've heard and I've said that in many ways other things have been unmasked, and that there's certain narratives and realities, right? Like the unfortunate truth that millions of people have been killed because of the color of their skin before George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but somehow an urgency or something was unmasked. There was a certain level that we saw across social, cultural, and racial groups, a certain urgency starting to develop around disparities. And what I would say, the role of faith and you use the word organized religion and organized faith. I think one is that we're organized. We have systems. We have spheres of influence, we have partnerships, and each faith group having different lanes of how we support and work in intergroup relations, how we support and the needs of our communities, I think is central. And on the note of the Jewish community and the work of Jewish federations, we recognize our role in stepping up in every generation. We've been around for a century in terms of the Jewish Federation's movement, both in America and supporting thriving Jewish life and civil society in 70 countries worldwide. And when it came to this summer and when it came to this year and the deep needs to respond to social inequities, to disparities, to certain things that maybe people weren't being sensitive to initially, that I would say not only the Jewish Federation system, but also broader organized Jewish communal life has been making that a key agenda item, like the topic of addressing social inequity, racial justice, representation, inclusive leadership. These discussions are creating organizational commitments to how we address inequities in society. I would say it has only been amplified in the last year, and the deep desire to respond.
Right. Umar, how about you and your community?
Good question. Solid question. For me, and this is my opinion, 2020 was a replay of what's been going on in America since day one. It's just now the curtain has been pulled, and now everybody's affected by what's going on, and now it's time to really not only just say something but do something. For the fact that for African Americans to constantly be mistreated and killed and assassinated, that trend is all in the timeline of America. You know what I'm saying? For COVID to especially affect African Americans. You know what I'm saying? That's another thing so for doctors who caught the COVID couldn't get help. Just like Charles Drew created plasma, he couldn't get help for his own invention. So 2020 has been a replay of what we need to truly fix going into 2021 and beyond. But on the flip side, the training that we've all had prior to 2020, because on my way, I was coming from Belgium, and on my first day back in the United States, I had a talk with the Red Cross, and they asked the question, what does this look like? I'm hoping that we are better coming out of COVID of 2020. Well, now we're in 2021, right? Because the training that we received in 2019, 2018, and 17 came into fruition, came into play in 2020. So a lot of us didn't really have to pivot, but those who may have ignored the training prior or the knowledge that they used prior had to pivot. So a lot of us who were already organized was ready to go to work.
Yeah.
Some essential workers in the game. Yeah.
And Dr. Pierce, I want to tweak the question just a little bit for you, because you represent what we think of as a more traditional Black church's experience. And had George Floyd or any of the, Michael Brown, even going back, had we experienced those moments in the 60s or the 50s, we would have immediately been in the church. We would have immediately, looked to the church to organize and guide us through. And I'm wondering how you see the church and organized religion playing a role in the social justice movement, and where did it kind of, was there a moment in our history? Was there an event that there was a shift where we stopped relying so heavily on the church to guide us in these moments?
So I want to maybe do three things just as quickly as possible, because I wanted to respond to my two dear brothers. I think that we just have to really lay bare some realities. And one of those realities is that white supremacy glorifies itself in imagery of violence against Black bodies. Let's be very, very clear about that the imagery that we are seeing of the violence done to Black people, to African Americans, men and women and children like Tamir Rice, our white supremacist nation glorifies in that violence, because they would not show those same images of violence against other people's bodies and other people's communities. This is nothing new in our nation. We had so many people leave their homes and leave their churches on a Sunday morning to watch African American men being lynched. They brought picnic baskets, they brought lunch, and they watched the burning and the lynching of Black men's bodies in the 1920s 1920s and on. And so we have to really be honest about the toll that that takes. And I want to suggest that part of the function of anyone who's interested in liberation, anyone who's interested in the role of faith within Black families, is to also talk about joy. It is to also talk about what imageries are not put forward. So we can replay violent event after violent event and car chase and all of the negativity that happens against Black people. And yet somehow we don't have a function of joy. That's what religious communities and spaces have provided. They have provided sanctuary. They have provided joy. They have provided catharsis. So as you suggest, Jessica, there were times, and there still are times, in which African Americans seek solace within their faith communities to deal with the ways in which racism and white supremacy and violence continues to manifest itself. January 6th, when we watched an insurrection in the Capitol, for many people, that evoked such trauma and such grief. And so for some people, they find, a solace within their faith communities. Others find solace within their Twitter communities, their Facebook groups. So I think we have to be honest that there are many ways in which people find communities in the face of such tragedy. But I would still say that those are spiritual spaces. What they're hoping to do is to connect with someone who appreciates their soul, who appreciates their presence and their very being. I think that churches and mosques and synagogues will always have a place to do that. But I will also say that particularly for many young African Americans, they find that in communities that are still spiritual, even though they might not be the religious institutions.
Right. And speaking of finding community, social media has had an impact on all of our institutions and ways that we connect and find community with others. And I'm wondering how that has impacted religion, especially with the disinformation and the untruths that live in a social media space. What responsibility does the religious community have with addressing that and helping their congregations filter through all the noise? Umar, let's start with you.
A couple of things has happened in the past maybe 10 years. The role of the woman has become really important as leaders in this situation. And the presence of the Muslim communities have been really vocal and present in this struggle going forward. The trauma that America is experiencing is an opportunity for Muslims to present the justice that is voiced in the Quran from the Creator. And we have, I can name names, but you have a lot of Muslim organizations on the ground assisting the Black church, assisting the Jewish community in understanding the root causes of anti-Blackness. You see what I'm saying? Just the other day, we celebrated Malcolm X's birthday. Someone who was once seen as a threat, now he's being celebrated. Yeah. Martin Luther King, that quote where he says, "All we want America to do is what they said is on paper. That's all we want." You know what I'm saying? So the Muslim community has definitely been a force when it comes to policy like Muslim Public Affairs Council, the Islah LAs, the Muslim Power. We've definitely been Muslim Arc, definitely been on the forefront as well as any other religious organization, and feel that it's our responsibility to be there, to be present for this struggle.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Rabbi Rothstein.
Wow, this conversation, there's so many pieces I want to on from what other folks have shared, like both of you. It's just been really, this is, well, one thing I would say that in thinking about two things I'll share that Dr. Pierce and both Umar spoke about. One was Umar started by saying faith is like a valley that has highs and lows. That was something that I remember you said. And then when Dr. Pierce was starting to speak about the role of faith community, like what is, and faith spirituality versus religious doctrine, and also transformative versus transactional. Sometimes there's rites or things we do, and how are we really creating spaces of joy? Like picking up on those pieces, I would say that the Torah, the Bible, the Jewish tradition, the spiritual technology that I think we've all been working with and inherited millennium from organized faith, and is in a way has never been more important and has never been more of a resource, in the sense that faith has always been responding to crisis. Faith has always been reacting to try to provide tools for healing and to cope and to adapt. And it's true that we're dealing with so many unprecedented realities, but faith has also brought us here, right? Like the conversation we're having, what would it look like without the Old or New Testament, like in the equation? Like, I don't even know. The Quran, like, I really mean it. Like, what would the world look like? And so in that way, I think the faith and faith communities, we have the ability to utilize this technology, these spiritual tools, these spiritual technology for our generation. And the key, it is an equity conversation, because it's about what do people need. It's not about what modes we used once or twice, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. It's what do people need? How do people show up whole? And if they're not able to show up whole, what do we need to draw from? And who do we need to partner with and connect from? And it might have been that a text that was like central for 10 years ago is now not the text that I need to use when communicating with who's with me. And so those are just a few reactions I would share.
Can I respond to the rabbi? I love that, because I think that you're really pointing to something that is both challenge and opportunity. And so I say challenge for the African-American Christian community when COVID happened and churches closed. They closed their doors. They had to. I'm in Washington, D.C. We still have restrictions on gatherings of sizes. So the vast majority of religious spaces are closed. Then it became, how do you still do church, do faith, do community, right? And one of the things we realized very quickly was that so many of our elders could not easily access the technology, either did not have iPads or did not have laptops or didn't whatever, or had some and didn't know how to get on the church Zoom or what have you. So what was and is a challenge, the digital divide, we know that to be a real challenge, becomes an opportunity, because then it says, what does a youthful generation owe to the elders of its faith? Right? Mm-hmm. And so then that's a time where you put your faith into practice. How do we make sure that our elders are tuning in? How are we still checking on them and still being safe during COVID? And now the challenge is the rollout of the vaccine. And the rollout of the vaccine for a community that has been disproportionately affected by the virus, they have less access to the vaccine that will help them to fight the virus, right? And that's a digital divide issue, because at least where I live, the rollout of the vaccine is get online, hurry up, sign up. If you get on 10 minutes and you're fighting for spots online, what does that mean for the 80-year-old African-American woman living somewhere where she does not have that? So these digital divides are an opportunity because they reflect the challenges of the racism in the nation, right? And so it has been a way to say, let's connect younger and older generations. Let's make sure that we are walking like we're talking. We can't talk about faith and spirituality and belief and God and liberation unless we're willing to do the work. And the work is now. The work is not in the future or some other time. The work is right now in our communities for the most vulnerable among us.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder what you all would say. Umar, I'll go back to you. If, what would you say to the Biden administration right now, and the important role that you all could play, that faith could play, and religious institutions could play in the vaccinations, in helping communities trust the vaccination? What would you like the administration to know about the importance you all have in the community?
If I could take a page out of the Jewish scriptures, there's a term that I've always worked under. tikkun olam, how to bring about justice, or to show a change for justice. I feel the Biden administration, it's time for them, because I don't want to tell my age, even though I'm a handsome 50, you know what I mean? I'm a handsome 50, and I just busted out to my community here, but I'm African-American, I'm a Black man, and I'm a Muslim in this country. For the last 50 years of my life, not too much has changed when it comes to policy and laws. So I would like to see the Biden administration understand the agenda of the Black community, because when you resolve the issues of the Black community, everything else will unravel, because everything affects us. When it comes to the vaccinations, education is definitely going to have to be provided, because we have a history of smallpox and blankets. We have a history of giving community syphilis. We have a history of the crack epidemic that was put into our community. So the Biden administration has a gap to fulfill in this country when it comes to ejecting any of us. And then I had a point, but I forgot. But in this election, we've seen many voices create or demonstrate the voices of Black America. And it's time to really pay attention to the values of Black America and what's really important to us as human beings in this country.
Thank you. Rabbi Rothstein, what would you like to share, and what would you say in a meeting with the Biden officials?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I wouldn't even begin to think about how I would get into a room with President Biden and Harris, but if the moment happened, I guess, and on this topic, I would probably want to know a few things. I would want to know that they're looking at all the data. I would want to make sure that they know what the needs are, that they see the disparities across for our population as a whole, for Americans. And then specifically when thinking about racial categorization and disparities, and how that, and housing discrimination and the systemic inequity and inequalities that exist, that's informed by data. I would then also want to make sure that they have a framework around racial equity and racial justice, social equity, social justice that is integrated into the entire administration, the entire staff. That would be like a second follow-up if I had the time. And then on the note of faith, and that's just to make sure that there's like the strategy is really is baked into the system and to the staff. And then on the faith, like I kind of come back to the needs of our generation and coping, the role of faith and healing. I like whether we believe in God or the universe or any capital letters or the Big Bang or just Mars, like anything bigger than us as humans, like those things. But to recognize that we live in one of, I think, the loneliest generations in American history, on record at least, and we have all this data that shows us just so much of what is needed. And we have the tools. We have the tools and the opportunity to really provide the things what people need. And I think with the U.S. government and the presidential, president's administration behind a plan like that, there's a lot we can do with the leadership we have. Yeah.
Dr. Pierce, is there anything you'd add to that?
So yes, again, the question of how I would find myself in that room, but just in case someone's listening, I'd love to be in that room. And I think that one of the conversations I definitely would want to have is about disparities, but I'd also want to have a conversation about what it means to live in a nation where robust government and the ideals of democracy are themselves values of faith communities. So I say that because the fact that we live in a democracy and that we are citizens of this nation, for me, is fundamentally connected to what we would call in theology, the Imago Dei, which is made in the image and likeness of God, right? The Quakers would say that all of us have a divine spark within us, right? And so I want us to think about the ways in which we are or failing to treat our fellow citizens with the reverence, care, and respect, right? This concept of loving your neighbor is weaved throughout all of the Abrahamic faiths. The idea that it's not just about me, but my neighbor, the stranger, the foreigner, the immigrant, right? And so we have these categories of persons dwelling within our nation. So I'd want a real robust conversation about what it means to be a citizen, what it means to live in a democratic nation, what it means to be concerned about one's neighbor, so that this individualistic pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can do it all by yourself. Not only is it unrealistic, it actually just has never happened. We are bound together. This king would always talk about this mutual web, right? We are connected to one another. When my Muslim brothers and sisters thrive, then I thrive. When my Jewish brothers and sisters are safe and no one is defacing their synagogues, then I thrive, right? When Black women within the African-American Christian church are leaders, everyone thrives, right? And so the way that there is a mutual web of our well-being and our thriving, and that it's connected together. And when we see that, then I think we can see the kinds of policy changes that we really need in this nation to make that a reality.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I want to go back.
Sign me up.
Wherever that conversation is happening, let me know, because that's where I want to be.
Yes. And I want to go back to you, Dr. Pierce, because you mentioned something about community, and when other communities thrive, that means that we thrive. And I want to get a sense from everyone, how important is it? You know, we are seeing what is happening within the Asian and Asian American community and the violence against them. How important is it for the Black community and Black institutions to speak up against violence against other communities?
It's absolutely critical. It is absolutely critical. Again, violence against any is violence against us all. And so our Asian brothers and sisters that are facing increasing violence, increasing backlash, the kind of rhetoric of the last administration that attempted to place at their feet responsibility for a virus, right? A thing. Right? It is to simply say that we have to be in solidarity with marginalized people wherever they are. And I really mean that. I mean that certainly locally, and I mean that globally. I mean that wherever marginalized people, we talk about it in Christian scripture as the least of these. And so if Asian Americans are facing violence, if they're facing taunting, if their communities are being threatened, then I have to, as a person of faith, say, I am in solidarity with you. Tell me how I can help. Tell me how I can be the best ally that I can be. I shouldn't make the assumption that I know how to be the best ally. I should be willing to be taught and to listen to someone say, this is how you can best help. But it is absolutely critical. These connections, the reason we're having an interfaith conversation is to say that this is critical. These interfaith, interracial conversations are necessary for citizenship.
Thank you. And Rabbi Rothstein and Umar, how are you seeing within the Jewish community and within the Muslim community, how are we pulling the respective communities together, be they Asian, Black, Native, Asian, Indian? How are we pulling the communities together as we move forward in our response to social injustice? Rabbi Rothstein, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Yes, I think just picking up on what Dr. Pierce was sharing about the language found within Scripture, within the canon, around the stranger, around the widow, around the orphan. These are muscles we have. Like, we've been taught, and when it comes to, at least in the 5 books of Moses, it says, the rabbis point out that it says 36 times, and some argue 46 times in the 5 books to not put press or put pressure on the stranger, on those who are othered or marginalized. And the rabbis go so far as to even codify it in amongst the 613 biblical commandments. The 431st of the biblical commandments is ahavat hager, to love, to care for, to support those who feel estranged, those who are, it's a part of who we are. And there is nothing in that law about where you come from, what color skin you have, what you believe. It is nothing. And so I'll just echo what was said so beautifully, like all forms of hate, we must stand together. We have a moral, spiritual obligation and 50 other reasons why it is better for us to stand together, and why I believe our faith traditions really lead us in that direction as well.
Yeah, thank you. Umar?
So real quickly, I want to take it back a couple of years back to in Los Angeles, Occupy LA.
Mm-hmm.
At that moment, all the stuff that we're experiencing now was on the table in that Occupied movement. We saw the African American community, you saw the white liberals, you saw the LGBT community, you saw the Muslim community, you saw the Christian. Everybody was there. Now, fast forward, a lot of them problems went unchecked till today.
Mm-hmm.
So if we continue to allow this oppression to go unchecked, it's going to spread to Mars, because they're trying to get to Mars now. You see what I'm saying? So if we allow this, from Sister Pierce to Rabbi to myself and you, Jessica, if we don't take this conversation that we're having now and take it out of theory and turn it into, we have to turn it into action. Because as a board chair for LA Voice, which is a multi-faith organizer here in Los Angeles, we organize not just with African Americans and the Latino community, we organize for the Asian community as well. We organize with the Jewish community as well. So right now we have to really realize, or come to the conclusion, that we all come from the same origin.
Mm-hmm.
And we all have a common enemy, and that enemy is named oppression. You see what I'm saying? So yes, we definitely have to, not going into 2022 and beyond, not to let the problems carry over or begin to create the policies to start remedy the future.
Thank you. And I want to encourage all of our participants again to drop your questions in the chat. We'll be getting to the Q&A portion in a moment. This is an interfaith conversation, and we're talking about Black faith. And I'm curious to know, what are some of, I have a very distinct memory and picture in my mind when I went to a Black church. I was raised Catholic, but through friends and family would have the opportunity to attend predominantly Black churches. And there is a very rich and beautiful traditions that I recall happening in those churches. And I'm wondering, as we become more diverse, and as those churches become more diverse, what are we at risk of losing in those churches in an effort to be inclusive?
That's an excellent question. So I think that it depends on the leadership, right? There are many multi-ethnic, multiracial churches in the United States that are actually just white churches that have multiracial members, right? That is not a Black church. A Black church is birthed out of the African and African diasporan context. It is 400 years old. It is when enslaved peoples were brought to these shores, and they were brought to these shores. Some 20 to 30% were practicing Muslim when they were brought to these shores. Some of them were practicing traditional African religions. Some of them had already been exposed to Christianity. The earliest synagogue in America was in America before America was a nation. So I say that to say there was a rich, deliberately rich diversity into which the Black church was born. That is not take white pastor, add Black members, and now you have a Black church. No, there are cultural traditions and practices and theology and iconography, and it is beautiful. We can be different and we can be beautiful. We can uphold our traditions and our culture and our peoples and our families and celebrate the diversity of everyone else. I don't want to lose the tradition in which I was raised, in which I was a part, which celebrated me and affirmed me as a little girl and sent me to college and supports me even now as a scholar. And so I can celebrate someone else's traditions, but I can also be thankful for the Mother's Board and the ushers and the Black Baptist preachers and the foot washing services, and because that is the tradition out of which I was raised. I talked earlier about joy. We get to celebrate and we get to have joy about the distinctiveness of each of our traditions. We can be in solidarity with one another, but we don't have to be the same. We can be distinct and also loving one another.
Yeah. And Rabbi Rothstein, I'm wondering what you're seeing within Judaism. Do we need Black synagogues, or is there room within predominantly white synagogues to, create a sense of belonging that would be unique to the Black experience, if that makes sense? You're on mute, sir.
Thank you. First, I would start by just saying a note about Jewish racial and ethnic diversity more broadly. There are Jews in over 70 countries worldwide. We've been a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural people for about 2,000 plus years in diaspora. I've literally been in synagogues in India, in Ethiopia, in Turkey. In terms of like the dominant voices of American Jewry, and Jessica, you point to 2044, the data point 2042, when America will become officially, for the first time ever, a majority non-white country, and in the increasing racial and ethnic diversity also within the Jewish community. And there are different data points of how many Black Jews there are, how many Asian Jews, Latin American Jews, Jews of color. Is the Jewish people of color. So our synagogues, our spaces, I think our hope, or I'll speak for myself, and I would say also what we believe through the work we're doing through Jewish federations, is that we believe in a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural community where, to again, Dr. Pierce's point, where we could celebrate our similarities and acknowledge and celebrate our differences. Like, we don't need to be the same. And I think holy dispute, holy differences, right? The word shalom, even in itself, means to bring together peace. It's actually mechabre trei hafachim, joining opposites, like real wholeness, shalom, like it's good for us to have those differences. And the unfortunate reality, though, is due to a lack of social infrastructure, often Jews of color, Black Jews, we find each other through word of mouth. And that's shifted largely in the last generation. My mother, who has been a Black Jewish woman for 40 plus years, wouldn't identify with the term Jew of color per se. Or, there's a lot of things that have shifted as America shifts within American Jewry as well. There's more there.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we're going to shift to some questions from the audience, and I'm going to start with a question from Brian Smith. Do you believe that religious institutions are doing enough to reach out to African Americans and other marginalized groups in the midst of the pandemic and the social justice unrest that we see? Let's start with you, Umar.
Do you believe the religious institutions are doing enough to reach out to African Americans and other? That's a good question. I believe more can be done in any situation, especially when you think about how far is your mosque, synagogue, or church, how far is your voice is going in your own community. Because if your neighbors cannot testify to your work out those church doors or mosque doors, or synagogue doors, then what are you doing? You know, I was in a conversation the other day with one of the members of Los Angeles. He said there's a church right across the street from our park, but they don't come out and counsel us. And they can say they don't come out and counsel us, or it's the same thing. So if I think the first place that the religious institutions can start in their neighborhood. Right there. You don't have to go all the way to Washington, D.C. No disrespect to DCs or DCers. You don't have to go all the way to Harlem. You could do right there out your door. Like at Isla LA, one of the problems that we face is I think the sister spoke on it, the disparities. So in COVID, groceries is becoming a disparity. So at our food pantry, they get to connect with the Muslims serving the community, the surrounding community. The Slauson Muslim community is right down the street from the Marathon store. So right there and there, we get to connect with the community, and they get to know, they get to feel that this institution, religious institution, is doing something to help us.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to go to another question from Jeremy Pierce. The question portion of it is, can you, Jeremy Pierce, excuse me, can you talk about the importance of ties between religious communities, like the ones you lead, and local governments? And I want to add a little bit to it because I'm joining you today from Detroit. This is where I live, and you know, one of the things that we see a lot here in Detroit is our religious leaders being politically active, which is great, but endorsing candidates very early on, you know, it being almost unwavering in support of people that might not have the best interest of the communities that they serve at heart. And I'm wondering, to Jeremy's question, what that relationship could look like, and specifically local governments. But so it's a political question and a local government question. And Dr. Pierce, I'm wondering what thoughts you have on that relationship.
So, you know, I think there's a certain kind of skepticism and cynicism, rightfully so, because what has happened in many African-American communities is that political leaders come to the faith communities around election time, and then they leave. So they come to get people to vote, to get people to support them, and then they leave. And so for me, if the simple answer to the question is that if there is going to be any kind of sustained relationship between political authorities and local religious organizations, it has to be between equals. It can't be, oh, it's almost time for election season, I'm going to come in, do a little spiel, and then I'm out the door, right? There has to be one in which, are you willing to listen in the middle of a crisis? Are you willing to hear us when it's not election season and when you're not up for re-election? Are you willing to talk to us if you are not the candidate that is in fact chosen? And so I think that there's a certain kind of healthy skepticism and cynicism among people who are involved in these conversations, largely because you really feel the disingenuousness of it sometimes, that the people who most want the vote, the people who most want the support of a religious community sometimes disappear in the middle of a crisis. Now, that's not everywhere and everyone. I think we can look at the current makeup of both the Senate and the House, and we see people of faith. And that's where I think the best of us is possible, where there are people of faith in our government who are serving, not because they're trying to remove the wedge between church and state, but they are serving out of a moral calling that they feel, that they have a vocational calling, they have a moral calling, they have an ethical calling, and their faith shows up in the ways in which they hope to govern. I'd love for us to have more conversation about what it means to have the senator from Georgia be the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, right? What does it mean for us to have people of faith who are within the political system and how their faith shows up? I don't, in fact, want to have another conversation about a politician coming to a Black church 2 weeks before the election.
Umar, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, to answer the brother's question, Mr. Paris, his last name is Paris, right? Mr. Paris, here in Los Angeles, the interfaith leaders from the Jewish to the Muslim to Christian communities, we all come together to speak about injustices here in Los Angeles. And this example can, this model that we have here in Los Angeles is an example that could go anywhere in the country. So right now, I could text several rabbis and get a response. Right now, I could text several reverends as well as imams and ustadas. Ustada is like a religious female scholar, and get their response. You know what I'm saying? We're all collectively working to resolve problems together. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the Muslim community is here to ally any of the previous group where the movement was rooted at, because we was also in those movements as well. So to answer your question, bro, we are here in Los Angeles, have a model, what you want to call it, pluralistic, solidarity, collectiveness, however you want to coin it. We are essential here in Los Angeles together.
Right. Thank you. For our last question from Mr. Kenneth Crawford, I think it's actually a really great way for us to transition to our conclusion of this conversation. And he asks, what advice or encouragement do you have for people who are alienated from religion by the religious nationalism currently on display? I'm going to start with you, Rabbi, and then we'll go around.
My mother always says, take the best and leave the rest. That's a line that I sit with. I think people that I may share a faith group with that I don't agree with, and feel even closer with people who have other faith groups. And I think just the idea of first recognizing, finding your own people, finding your own community, finding people that know who you are, believe in you, will sit with you. That's that is such a luxury, so underrated, so underrated. But then I would also say that specifically for me, like when I think about this moment, we're on a generational timeline, and we have the ability to shift when we see things wrong. It is on us. Like we are someone else's ancestor. We have ancestors, and if there are things that strike us, then it is with those people that we could create something different. So that's my hope.
Thank you. Umar?
For anybody who has ever received spiritual abuse from any of from their congregation, I will definitely instruct them to go back to the Word of God, wherever their tradition is, and find a verse or a line in that speech to comfort them, and then find that one person in that community who they can have a dialogue with around that verse to help resolve it, and hopefully that conversation will open up solutions to the healing of this spiritual abuse that we all have experienced. So definitely go back to the Word of God, identify a verse, find someone trustworthy who you feel you can have this conversation with that could turn into a dialogue, and start the healing like that.
Thank you. And Dr. Pierce?
So I thank the person for that question. I don't remember the name, but that's an excellent question, because I really struggle. The Christian nationalism that is on display is not my faith and has never represented me. It has not ever represented my community. It has never represented my elders. And so sometimes I feel very, very sad that those people call themselves Christians, and I also call myself a Christian. But I'm reminded of this. I get to tell my own story. I get to tell the story of my community. I get to tell the story of a liberating gospel. I get to tell the story of a people who have made a way out of no way. That is not the story being told from many, many places, but I am a part of telling my story and my ancestors' story, and the story that will be hopefully part of my legacy. And I take that seriously. So there are some people out here who want you to tell your own story so that the dominant narrative doesn't silence you.
Thank you all. As I said, I'm from Detroit, so I know better than to be the last word with a group of religious leaders. So I'm going to allow you all to have the last word. And I would love for you to just tell us and tell our guests what faith and or religion can mean for them in this moment of uncertainty and how it has helped you get through this time. So we'll start with Dr. Pierce and then go our way around.
It has, for me, been a saving grace to know that there is something bigger and better and beyond myself, to be in community with people of faith all over the world, but also to recognize that there are brothers and sisters in this country, in this world, who do not share my faith and also have no faith. And that's okay, because we're still on this journey together. And so for the agnostics and the atheists and the humanists and the people who've long ago abandoned their faith, I still see your humanity and recognize it in my own.
Thank you. Umar?
My last words is thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. And right now is a unique time, very unique time for us to create allies, for us to create, deepen our networks, present our agendas, especially around what's common, on common values, and go to work. Let's keep those in Washington accountable. You know what I'm saying? Let's keep them. Let's keep. I can't say that, but let's keep the prices down. I had a little quick story, but that's not a part of this right now. But let's. It's a lot of information out there. Stay rooted in your faith. It's going to these times are going to shake you, no doubt, but keep your moral support system close to you so you can move forward. And don't be surprised, and always know that the Creator is the most merciful.
Thank you. And Rabbi Rothstein?
The Hebrew word for faith is emunah. And some break up the word emunah into aleph, the first letter of the alphabet. Moneh means to count, to always count by aleph, by one, to always go back to that oneness. So maybe that's myself. I should be blessed to have alignment of that oneness with myself, with my loved ones, and with the world around me, and with the spirit and the universe. Like that, to me, is something that faith has empowered me to sit with. One thing that I just bless us, that also I come to through my faith, is that even though in my lifetime I may not see the world perfected, or I may not see the world brought to a redemptive and messianic state, I'm still going to work my butt off to try to fulfill that. And that, to me, is something that my faith also grounds me in. So we should be blessed.
Yes, absolutely. And with that, I thank you all for joining us today. It has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you to my guests, Dr. Yolanda Pierce, Umar Hakim, and Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein. And we look forward to seeing you for our next conversation. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.